evening. And how are y'all doing today or tonight? Wonderful. Okay, does anybody have any idea what today is or tonight? 6 o'clock? Shabbat. Yes, yes. And we just so happen to have a person from Israel that's going to perform for us. Moshe Osri from Israel, would you please come up here? He's going to do the prayer, okay?
Shalom to everybody. Shalom. Do you hear me well? Yes. Okay. I just want to thank you for allowing me even to do that. Years before, I would never, ever in my life would think that I'll have an opportunity to come and share with you. But it's happening, meaning God moved all of us to a new stage, a new place, and this is beautiful. I'm going to pray and receive the Shabbat. Shabbat, this is His day. He says in scriptures, remember my day. So when we pray in Friday night, Shabbat, we are receiving and remembering His day. But before I'll do that, I would like to share with you a little bit what the burden that I have in my heart. Israel is in a situation right now that need your support and your help, and especially your prayers. Israel needs you to go out there and share good things about us. Because wherever we go or hear in the news, we are always the bad guys. It doesn't matter what we'll do. We are always the bad guys. But I see each one of you as an ambassador to go and just talk good things about us, because we are not the bad guys there. I can share with you so many different stories, but this is not the time. I have just 5 minutes, and I will do my best. I want you to pray for Israel. I want you to pray for Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu is a prime minister of Israel that speaks and talks, not what other people want to hear. He talks the truth. This is the first prime minister that not bend to others. He's fighting literally and physically to save Israel. We know our neighbors, and when they promise to destroy Israel, they are going to try to do that. And we better believe them. There is a contract that had been signed just this month. This is the month of Av in the Jewish calendar. This is the month that for all along the history we had a very bad news, and this is one of them. So I want you all, see, Israel, this is not just my land. Israel is your land. If you have the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in your heart, this is part of who you are. Jerusalem is the only place that Abba, God, chose for Himself. And He brought the Shekinah there. In Israel, God is in 3 dimensions. You can smell Him, hug Him, kiss Him, whatever. Obviously, He's everywhere, but there you can walk with Him. It's a totally different feeling. So what I would like you to do, please, as an Israeli and a Jew, pray for Jerusalem. This is the time for Jewish and Gentiles to come together. This is the time for us to fulfill the prophecy. If we will not do that, we're lying to ourselves. See, I'm here, I'm Israeli and a Jew. It's a miracle for me. And you accepting me. I need to know you. I need to love you. But we need to stick together, to know each other, to love each other. So allow me now to receive Shabbat and pray. ברוך אתה, אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא פרי הגפן. We are all says amen. יברכך אדוני וישמרך. יאר אדוני פניו אליך ויחונקה. יישא אדוני פניו אליך וישם לך שלום. May God bless you all and may God keep you all. Thank you so much. L'chaim. Shabbat shalom. Maybe next time I'll get 10 minutes. Thank you.
Wasn't that wonderful? Okay, speaking about Israel, I just want to mention some of the seats. I don't know if everybody has one, but we are offering a trip to Israel in November. Prophecy in the News is going to sponsor it, and Dr. Kevin Clarkson is going to be the host of it. It's November 14th to the 23rd, and if each and every person wants to support Israel, we will be staying on the Israeli side. So everything that the proceeds, everything is going to go to Israel. And so if you'll look that over, and if you're interested in it, Jeff Harbuck out there will be able to answer any questions and help you get registered for it. Our speaker that's coming in just a few minutes, I've got to tell you, this person is an American history book. He walks it, talks it. He can recite the Constitution. I mean, he is just one amazing person. His article in our magazine was just phenomenal. And before I get any further, and he's got to come up here to speak, I want to welcome Bill Federer, please.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
Well, it is a tremendous honor for me to be here with you, and it's a great event. Thank you for the Shabbat and the prayer, and the Lord bless Israel. Well, I'm going to go ahead and jump into my presentation. Arthur Schlesinger was a historian on John F. Kennedy's cabinet. He said, "History is to the nation as memory is to the individual." Have you met an individual who's lost their memory? Maybe they have Alzheimer's. They can't remember who they are. They can't remember who you are. They don't know where they came from or where they're going. Well, in America, we've lost our corporate memory. We forgot who we are. Here we are, the freest and most prosperous country that the planet has ever seen, and we don't remember how we got here. And as a result, we're letting it slip through our fingers like sand. Well, we just had a Supreme Court decision on gay marriage, and when you look at it, it's simply a very creative way to declare war on Christianity. War has been declared. So once gay marriage is passed, they don't really go get weddings, they go to the preschools, and they begin indoctrinating little children that if there is a God, he's so confused, he's putting men in women's bodies, and you have to do operations to fix it. And then if that is not a sin, which the Bible calls an abomination, if that's not a sin, well, there really are no sins. And if there are no sins, you certainly don't need a Savior. And then once you get into it, it breaks down the whole picture of the church being the bride of Christ. You know, in the Old Testament, it says, "Oh, Israel, I've betrothed you to myself," you know, and then the Apostle Paul says that the church is the bride of Christ. And so if this is taught to the kids, that it breaks down the whole Christian theology. And so it goes from that to worse. And so we see they begin to call the kids in school hateful if they believe that there's a mom and a dad. In California, they don't use the terms mother and father in the public schools. And they're beginning to call anybody that does not embrace their agenda as intolerant. And so bully in school, and then they want to re-educate you, boycott businesses, sue businesses. Businesses can lose their licenses, censor sermons in Houston, and they're threatening radio licenses. I've talked with the NRB president, and they said it's still up in the air. And then threaten 501c3 status. And if that isn't bad enough, we begin to see that the church is more or less silent. Did you know that there's a Latin phrase, qui tacet consentit, and I'm not a Latin speaker, but in international diplomacy, a proposal is deemed agreed upon unless any member raises an objection. In the Old Testament, there's a story in the law that if a father hears a daughter and she made a vow and he has a day to say something, if he does not say something, her vow stands. If he says something, well, then she's released from her vow. And so his silence gives consent. And so if we are silent with this, we are giving our consent to it. And Jesus said, if you cause one of these little ones to stumble, it's better that a millstone be put around your neck. And so if we're being silent, we're giving consent to this, and we don't want those little ones to stumble. And then we see trends, and we look at Europe. Europe has gone from a Judeo-Christian past to a secular, free-sex, gay-neutral, and now Europe is going into an Islamic future. And so in history, you see trends, and so this is the trend. Europe was all Catholic, and then it had a Protestant Reformation in Jewish neighborhoods. They were called ghettos. They were not allowed to live outside of their neighborhood. And so they had verses they did not always live up to, but they were bothering their conscience, like everyone's equal, made in the image of the Creator, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And Europe went from that to neutral with the French Revolution. Robespierre put a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covered her with a sheet, said, this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. They turned cathedrals into temples of reason. They didn't want, like our Constitution, done in the year of the Lord, 1787, so they made 1792 the new year one. And they didn't like a Sabbath, a 7-day week with a Sabbath rest, because the Sabbath went back to the Bible, so they came up with a 10-day week. They said 10 was the number of man, 10 fingers and 10 toes. Then they made everything divisible by 10. They called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system. And so it was this effort to de-Christianize Europe. And they would chop off 40,000 heads in Paris, kill 300,000 in the Vendée. They actually sent out their secular armies to these rural areas and killed and butchered the people that didn't want to go along with this new secular agenda. But once Napoleon spread this French secularism all around Europe, Europe became secular. And after a while, they began to say, well, bring in whatever you want. There's nothing special about our Judeo-Christian past. So into Europe came all these new beliefs. And finally, Sharia law Islam came into Europe and is now taking over. And so Muhammad's the #1 name for newborns in London, Milan, Brussels. The #1 crime in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark is rape. Muslim immigrant men raping European women. 10 years ago, there were 3 mosques in Germany. Today, there's over 200. Most of southern Holland is Moroccan Muslim. And so there's 751 neighborhoods surrounding Paris that have been completely taken over by 5 million Muslim immigrants. And the best the police can do is put up a sign that says, enter at your own risk. It's ZUS, Zonas Urbanas Sensibles, sensitive urban zones. And so we see in America, it's not just gone from get rid of the Bible and become this secular gay. Now we're beginning to see the introduction of Islam into the public schools. And kids are being taken on field trips to mosques, being taught Islamic prayers, to put on the little veils. And the textbooks now present Islam in a positive light, and it presents Judeo-Christian faith with skepticism. There's Gulen Muslim charter schools where they're closing down schools. I was talking to someone in St. Louis, Missouri. The Muslims have started 7 Gulen charter schools in downtown St. Louis. So all these inner city neighborhoods, now they're sending their kids to these Muslim schools. And now we're beginning to see that it's infiltrating the military. So again, we see this trend, drive, neutral, reverse. Western civilization's gone from Judeo-Christian to secular, gay, and now it's going into an Islamic direction. And David Horowitz said, there's an unholy alliance between the left and radical Islam. And this presents the greatest threat to the United States has faced in our lifetime. So you see the picture there, Islam and liberalism are teaming up so Western civilization can commit suicide. So this unholy alliance, the ACLU atheist homosexual agenda, they do not like Judeo-Christian expression, and the fundamentalist Muslims do not like Judeo-Christian expression, so they see themselves as allies together. Now, not realizing that when it finally happens, the Muslims will get rid of the secular, sort of like in Holland, the one homosexual said, I only learned how to enjoy my liberties, never defend them. And we have to remind ourselves, if we go back in history and see some examples, the next step is Christianity is being driven out of the military, and the homosexual agenda is being brought into the military, and now we're seeing Islamification being brought into the military. What will happen once the Christian influence is no longer in our military? Remember that? It was a crime to be an open homosexual in the military, Bill Clinton said, well, you can be one, just don't talk about it, don't ask, don't tell. Harry Reid, the last thing he did in a lame duck Senate was to push through the lifting of the don't ask, don't tell, so now you can serve openly as a homosexual, and now they're beginning to use it as a hammer to drive out anybody that doesn't embrace that agenda. I was on an airplane with a 30-year military career person, and he said he just got the memo that says this particular month is Gay Pride Month. Silence will be interpreted as protest. And so he says, what am I supposed to do? Go up and pat him on the back? I don't agree with it, but it's becoming hostile to be Christians in the military. When have we seen this before? Well, let's go back and look at the Roman Empire period of history. There were 9 major persecutions, 10 in the first 3 centuries, and there was an emperor named Gallienus, and he sort of lightened up on the persecution. Didn't change the law, but he didn't enforce them, so the Christian revival spread, and a whole lot of people in the military became Christian. Well, things were going along fine until Daclaration became the emperor around 280 AD. And he lost some battles with Persia, and he asked his generals why. And the general said, well, you've neglected the Roman gods. So Diocletian orders all the military to return to worshiping the Roman gods. Well, the Christians can't worship the Roman gods, so they are forced out of the military. Once all the Christians are forced out of the military, Diocletian decides to use the military to force the entire Roman Empire to return to worshiping the Roman gods. And he sends them systematically, province by province, tearing down churches, burning the scriptures, cutting out their tongues, boiling them alive. It goes on for 30 years and doesn't stop until Constantine stops it. And so what can we expect once the Christian conscience is driven out of our military? Instead of them suing, instead of them boycotting, they may be tempted to use the force of arms to enforce their agenda, especially with the Islamification efforts going on in our military. And we seem to have a short memory. In the 1930s, Stalin killed an estimated 20 million Ukrainians. This is an atheistic government killing its own citizens. In the 1950s, Mao Zedong had 80 million killed in China, an atheistic secular government killing its own people. Pol Pot killed a third of Cambodia in the 1970s. I mean, these are relatively recent examples. Has anything changed in human nature? And maybe I missed the memo. No, I think it's still potentially there. And anyway, so the persecution is increasing. Now, I'm going to take us on a little trip through history, and I'm going to show how unique America is and how important it is for us to work to maintain our country. There's been approximately 6,000 years of recorded human history. Did you know that? Writing was invented around 3300 BC, Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. And then Egypt, around 3000 BC, they had their hieroglyphics, and then the Chinese characters. And so 3,000 or 4,000 BC, we're around 2080, so that's 5,000 or 6,000 years, right? 2 and 4, that's 6. So 6,000 years of recorded human history. The Chinese invented their pictograms, their characters, beginning with the Yellow Emperor around 2600 BC. And so writing is relatively recent. So if we look at James Wilson, he was a signer of the Declaration and the Constitution and put on the Supreme Court by George Washington. He said, after a period of 6,000 years since creation, the United States exhibit to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that system of government under which they and their posterity should live. He thought something really special happened right here in America. And Daniel Webster said, miracles do not cluster, and what has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. He thought something special happened right here. And so 6,000 years. It's only 60 people living 100 years each. How many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years? Maybe a grandmother? We're talking 60 grandmothers, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. It's not that long. But it's been a 6,000-year quest to rule the world. And so we see, during this 6,000 years, empires have risen, empires have fallen, empires have risen, and empires have fallen. But one thing keeps repeating, power concentrates into the hands of one person. And we call this one person by different names: Caesar, Caliph, Chairman, Chieftain, Communist, Dictator, Dar, Despot, Dey, Grand Mughal, Kaiser, Khan, King. The name changes, but the function remains the same. Power gravitates into the hands of one person. And I believe it goes back to the fall in the garden and Cain killing Abel and selfishness coming into the human DNA. And so we see this is history. And it's like a pull of a magnet, a law of gravity. It's like a pecking order. You remember The Lord of the Rings, the movie? There's a line where Gandalf tells Frodo, always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Power wants to concentrate. And so it's this selfish human nature, and Cain killing Abel. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one of them will take the rattle from the others. You put some kids on a playground, one of them is the bully hogging the ball. Put some natives in the woods, one of them is the Indian chief, and put them in an inner city, one of them is the gang leader. And so this power wants to concentrate, and all a king is, in a sense, is a glorified gang leader. And it's this hierarchical system where if you are friends with the king, you are more equal. If you are not friends with the king, you are less equal. And if you're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason. So for most of world history, equality was how close of an orbit can you and your family get to the royal family. And now, this is the most common form of government in world history, and it's a king. Now, how did it change? I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour to show you how we came up with America. Remember I talked about us having Alzheimer's as a nation and not remembering where we came from? Well, I'm going to quickly show us. We're going to start in 610 AD. Now, Muhammad started his faith, and for the first 12 years, he was a religious leader in the pagan city of Mecca, and he only made 70 converts in 12 years. He gets confrontational. The Meccans chase him out of town for disturbing the peace. He flees north 210 miles to a Jewish city called Medina. The Jews are nice. They let him stay. They reject his faith, but he goes into the minority neighborhoods in Medina, and he begins to organize a following. We're familiar with the term of organizing in the community. He gets a following. He goes back to the Jewish leaders, and he presents himself as a candidate of change, that he's a newcomer to the politics of the city. He can rise above their partisanship. The Jews make a treaty with Muhammad, and now Muhammad is a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. Then something happens. His followers in Mecca, they get confrontational, argumentative, threatening, the way some of his followers are today. They get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. They go to Medina, and Muhammad allows his followers to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing him out of town. And so where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, his attitude was, if they take your house, you retaliate, take their caravan. He got a whole chapter of the Quran from his Allah on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. It's Surah 8, chapter 8. He gets a fifth of the booty. And so he has these 300 warriors, and they're robbing the caravans. And so the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to protect their caravan, and Muhammad with 300 defeats them at the Battle of Badr in 624 AD. This amazing victory, having been outnumbered 3-1, convinces Muhammad to be a military leader, and he fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. He even used the catapult when he attacked the city of Al-Taif, and when he was told the catapult was smashing and killing innocent women and children, his response was, they are among them. So they got to be killed too. So suicide bombers and ISIS killers today say it's okay to kill innocent people to advance Islam because Muhammad did. And so he chopped off the heads of, thousands of Jews in Medina. And so we see it's a threefold system. That Muhammad goes from being a religious leader to a political leader to a military leader. Sort of like in your car, RPM, revolutions per minute. And so there's freedom for all religions in America. But Islam is not just a religion because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was a political and a military leader. So a mosque is a religious building, a political building, and a military building. Bowing to Mecca is a religious bowing, a political bowing, and a military pledging of allegiance to another capital. And our effort in the West to split the religious side of Islam away from the political military side is we're trying to split Muhammad. Who are we to split their prophet? He was all three. And since he's the best Muslim that ever lived, Muslims that want to be better Muslims, they want to be more devout Muslims, they want to be more fundamental, they want to be like him religiously, politically, and militarily. And so we see that power concentrates into the hands of one person. Islam kicks it into high gear, and it concentrates power spiritually, religiously, politically, militarily into the hands of one person. First it was Muhammad, then the caliphs and the sultans. And we see within 5 years of Muhammad immigrating to the Jewish city of Medina, there's not a Jew left in the city of Medina. They were chased out, killed, or enslaved. And within 5 years of Muhammad's death, every pre-existing culture in Arabia was wiped out. And they go on this lightning expansion where they conquer Yemen, which used to be a Jewish kingdom. And Ghassanids were Arab Christians. Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. Syria was the first country to completely be Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. And Antioch, Syria, is where the name Christian was first used. And then Egypt was Christian, evangelized by Mark that wrote the gospel. Egypt was Christian for 6 centuries until Amir ibn Alas invaded. And there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century, all wiped out by the Umayyad Muslims. Then they invaded into Spain. And we see this lightning expansion. Now, when this happened, it was a heart attack on the Roman economy. because Rome, the boot of Italy, had traded with North Africa and the Middle East, all of a sudden gone. It was conquered by Islam. It'd be sort of like today if suddenly China held back their ships and all of our Walmart shelves would be empty and our retail industry would grind to a halt. Well, that's what happened with Rome. But one of the ships that the Muslims held back were the ships full of papyrus. These were reeds that grew along the Nile Delta that they dried out and used for paper. So suddenly, there was an immediate paper shortage in Europe, and they began to write fewer books and become less literate, and we call this the Dark Ages. So Islam is largely responsible for Europe entering the Dark Ages. And then they invade Spain in the year 711. They're on horseback with stirrups and scimitar swords. The Spaniards are still on foot. So in 10 years, they conquer all of Spain, cross the Pyrenees, conquer southern France. They're finally stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. They go from Arabia to Paris in a military campaign. Now, had Charles Martel not stopped them at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, we would be speaking Arabic right now, because German, French, English, and Spanish would have never developed as languages. We'd be like Egypt, where the Muslims cut out the tongues of anybody caught speaking the Coptic Egyptian language. And so it took, the Pope Gregory puts out a plea that anybody that could fight should join Charles Martel. He fights, and he wins his first battle 5 years later, and it takes 700 years of battles to drive the Muslims out of Spain. Then they come around the other side of the Mediterranean, and they invade into the Byzantine Empire. Today we call it Turkey. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by the Muslim Turks. Ephesus, Colossae, Galatia, these letters in the New Testament, those cities were wiped out by the Muslims. And so as they're invading, the Greeks beg the West for help. The West sends help. It's called the what? The Crusades. There's 9 major crusades in 200 years. Richard the Lionheart leads the 3rd crusade, leaves his brother King John in charge of England. Remember the Sherwood Forest and the Nottingham and who? Robin Hood. And then Richard comes back, rules for 5 years, and he's shot with an arrow and killed, taking back a castle in Normandy. And so John takes over again, and he's taxing and arbitrarily taking away land. And so the 25 barons of England surround King John on the fields of Runnymede and force him to sign the Magna Carta in June of the year 1215, exactly 800 years ago this year, limiting the arbitrary power of a king. Anyway, so the Crusades happen, and that when the Crusades end, the Muslims pick up where they left off, and they invaded into Europe. Now, this is all on the map, what the Muslims controlled in the year 1300. All of Spain, North Africa, the Zanzibar coast, down to Madagascar, over to Indonesia, northern India, the Mughals, Central Asia. A Muslim leader named Tamerlane wiped out Christianity in Central Asia. He had a Quran so big they had to carry it around in a wheelbarrow. He killed 17 million people, left pyramids of skulls, told his soldiers to come back with a skull in each hand. And so then the Muslims invaded into the Middle East, which was the birthplace of Christianity, and then into Eastern Europe. And as they invaded into Eastern Europe, they finally crossed the Bosporus, where the Black Sea empties into the Mediterranean, and they surround Constantinople. Now, Constantinople had been the capital of Europe after Rome fell. Rome fell in 476 AD. Constantinople lasted until 1453, almost 1,000 years later. And so when the Muslims surround it, there's an interesting dynamic. On the map there, you can see some green and brown islands. Well, those are Venetian and Genoan merchant states. These are Western European Venetians and Genoans who are selling military goods to the Muslims for $1, knowing that the Muslims are going to turn around and use it against the Christian defenders of Constantinople. So you have financial interests in the West betraying the West to Islam for money. Maybe for Saudi oil money, or maybe contributions from wealthy Muslims, and they'll sell out their civilization. Anyway, when Constantinople was conquered in 1453, it ended the land trade routes to get from Europe to India and China. Are you still with me? Did I lose anybody in the 8th century? You're still with me, okay. So people forget, adjust my mic here, people forget Marco Polo in 1271 went from Venice, Italy to China. And he worked for Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. Marco Polo brought back spaghetti, coal, gunpowder, talked about the Chinese inventing thread from worms, silkworms. Chinese invented paper currency. They made paper from tree pulp rather than the papyrus reeds. And so if you got paper currency in your wallet, that was started under the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan. And so since it was the Yuan dynasty, they call it the yuan, and it's still the dollar unit of measure financially for China. And then the Chinese had invented the compass, the wheelbarrow. They had a Pony Express where they could communicate with their whole empire. They were technologically superior to Europe. And India had teas, dyes, and spices. And so the Europeans wanted to trade with India and China. But when the Muslims conquered Central Asia and sacked Constantinople in 1453, it ended the land trade routes and caused the Europeans to begin to look for a sea route. And so in what year? 1492, a guy named Columbus said, I have a shortcut to get to India and China, sail west. Columbus runs into some islands. He thinks he's in India, so he names the people he meets the Indians. Think of it, we never would have called Native Americans Indians if it was not for Islamic Jihad. All the references to Indians, we never would have called them Indians. Had Columbus not thought he was an Indian, he gave him the name and it stuck. Right? Anyway, and now as the Muslims were invading into Greece, the Greek scholars fled west to Florence, Italy, and they took with them their Greek art, architecture, and literature. So this sudden bringing of Greek stuff into Florence, Italy in the late 1400s, we call the Renaissance. So Islam's responsible for the Dark Ages when they conquer Egypt and hold back the ships of papyrus. And then Israel's responsible for the Renaissance when they invade Greece and all the Greek scholars flee further west with their Greek art, architecture, and literature. But the Greek scholars also flee west with something else, their Greek New Testaments. And so now the Europeans begin to translate the Bible not just to Latin, but all the way back to Greek. All right, Erasmus did, and that laid the foundation for what we call the Reformation, started in 1517 with Martin Luther. But in 1529, 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna, Austria, under Suleiman the Magnificent. He vows to conquer all of Europe. Martin Luther says, the Turk is the rod of the wrath of the Lord our God. If the Turk's God, the devil, is not beaten first, there is reason to fear the Turk will not be so easy to beat. The fight against the Turks must begin with repentance. We must reform our lives, or we shall fight in vain. Our sins and ingratitude have earned God's wrath and disfavor, so he justly gives us into the hands of the devil and the Turk. John Calvin said, I hear the sad condition of your Germany. The Turk again prepares to wage war with a larger force. Who will stand up to oppose his marching throughout the land at his mere will and pleasure? And John Wesley later wrote, ever since the religion of Islam appeared in the world, espousers of it have been of wolves and tigers to all other nations, rending and tearing all that fell into their merciless paws. 2 centuries before the Reformation, Thomas Aquinas wrote, Muhammad seduced the people by promises of carnal pleasure. Those who believed in him were brutal men, desert wanderers, through whose numbers Muhammad forced others to become his followers by the violence of his arms. Now, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent controlled this huge area. All in North Africa, Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, into the Arabia, the Persia, the Syria, into the Turkey area, and then all into Eastern Europe. And his counterpart was the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor of Spain. He controls Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, Italy, countries in Europe, and then through marriage, the Portuguese holdings, and then the New World. And then the Philippines are named after his son, King Philip of Spain. And so these were the two superpowers, sort of like the Cold War with the U.S. and the USSR. Back then, it was the, instead of the USSR, it was the Ottoman Turkish East, right, the Muslims, and it was the Holy Roman Emperor Catholic West. Now, as a Catholic, Charles V of Spain is faced with what he considers a double dilemma. Protestant Reformation on one hand and Muslim invasion on the other hand. And because the Muslim invasion is so terrible, he decides to strike a deal with the Protestants. It's called the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. It's the first treaty to recognize Protestants, and in this treaty is a little Latin phrase, cuius regio eius religio, which means, whose is the reign, his is the religion. In other words, look, Protestant prince, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against these Muslims because they want to kill us all. And now Charles V would have never done that had he not been in a very dire situation and needed to do that. But once he did that, it actually started a domino effect in Europe, where whatever the king believed, the kingdom had to believe. And so northern Germany and Lutheran, the princes decided to be Lutheran. Switzerland, Calvinist. Scotland, Presbyterian. Holland, Dutch Reformed. Greece was Greek Orthodox. Russia was Russian Orthodox. England was Anglican. And of course, Spain, Portugal, France, Austria, Italy, Poland remained Catholic. But it was a situation in Europe where it was one Christian denomination per country. Right? Prior to that, it was all Catholic Holy Roman Empire, but because of this Muslim invasion, he said, look, believe whatever you want. Well, they did decide they believed whatever they want, but he didn't anticipate it was going to go into lots and lots of different denominations. And so the situation was, if you did not believe the way your king did, you were persecuted and you fled. And so power was concentrated into the hands of the kings. And if you didn't believe the way your king did and his government did, you were persecuted, you fled. So there was this mass migration of people shifting around Europe in the 1600s simply for conscience sake. And those were the ones that spilled over and founded colonies in America. And so we see that every colony in America was started by a different Christian denomination. I read through every charter of every colony. I have a book called The Original 13 where I go through the original 13 colonies. Virginia was an Anglican colony from 1606 to 1786. Massachusetts was a Puritan colony. New York was a Dutch Reformed colony. New Hampshire and Connecticut were Congregational colonies. Maryland was a Catholic colony originally. New Jersey and Delaware were Swedish Lutheran colonies. Then they were taken over by the Dutch and taken over by the British. Rhode Island was founded by Baptists. North Carolina was officially Anglican, but they left a loophole that the Lord proprietors could let other denominations in because they wanted to hurry up and populate the colony so they could get a financial return on it. And so lots of Presbyterians and Scots-Irish and French Protestant Huguenots, and they all Quakers and Puritans, they flood into the Carolinas. Then they get a new Anglican governor that decides to tighten the screw and say, we got to get more Anglican. Well, that's when South Carolina said, no, we're going to split away. And so South Carolina broke away. And then Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers. Georgia was plain Protestant. And guess what? They did not get along. Like in Europe, if you didn't believe the way the king did, you were persecuted, you fled. In these colonies, their attitude was, if you don't like our denomination, fine, start your own colony. I mean, the Puritans in Massachusetts not only hung witches, 19 of them, they hung Quakers. 4 Quakers were hung as heretics in Massachusetts. In Dutch Reformed New York, they chased out the Lutherans. In Anglican Virginia, they chased out the Puritans. I mean, it was going on until the Revolutionary War started. And then they said, look, we all have to work together against the King of England because he wants to take away all of our rights. Very similar to the situation with Charles V of Spain and these Protestant princes saying, look, we may not agree, but let's work together to stop the Muslims because they want to kill us all. And so we see that when there's unity, Islam is stopped. When there's division, Islam spreads and so forth. But we're going on. Now, I'm going to focus in on New England. Virginia was an Anglican colony, again, from 1606 to 1786. All these other colonies. But New England is where a unique experiment took place. The Pilgrims came across. They were going to land in Virginia. They got blown off course, and it was a terrible winter. And so the captain said, no more sailing. You're going to spend the winter here. And they said, well, we can't get off and be every man a law unto himself. We need something. And so they write the Mayflower Compact, the first constitution written in the New World. What was revolutionary about the Mayflower Compact? It was them granting themselves permission to start a government. In ye presence of God, we mutually covenant ourselves together to form a civil body politic and agree to render all due submission to the laws we pass. Again, I read through all the other charters. Most of them, it's the king designating who's in charge in his place. Is it the Lord Proprietor? Is it the royal governor? Whatever. This is the Pilgrims granting themselves permission and then agreeing to submit to it. It was revolutionary. It became a blueprint for the other New England colonies. And so New England is where you had pastors and their churches starting communities. So there was a Reverend John Cotton in his church, and they founded Salem, Massachusetts. And a Reverend John Lothrop and his church founded Barnstable, Massachusetts. And Reverend Roger Williams and his church founded Providence, Rhode Island. And Reverend Thomas Hooker and his church founded Hartford, Connecticut. His statue was actually on the state capitol building. Reverend John Wheelwright and his church founded Exeter, New Hampshire. So in New England, it was not separation of church and state. It was the church that created the state. You had pastors, right? And they were maybe in the Puritan area. And they said, you know what? We don't agree with the Puritan doctrine. Everybody that wants to, follow me. We're going to get our wagons and our horses and our oxen. And we're going to go hill and dale for a while. And then we're going to run into some creek. And we're going to say, let's plant here. And we're going to chop down trees and build a little church. And then the people go to the pastor and say, well, how do we do our government? How did this government thing, how do we do it? And so the pastors created the government. Thomas Hooker gave a sermon. The people of his church went out, took the sermon, wrote it down. It became the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And then Connecticut got called the Constitution State. Still has it on their license plate. And so Calvin Coolidge writes, in the principles which went into the Declaration of Independence are found in the sermons of the early colonial clergy. They preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. In order that they might have freedom to express these thoughts and opportunities to put them into action, whole congregations with their pastors migrated to the colonies. Now, these pastors held two different views. One was the Calvinist Puritan view. The other was the Pietist view. Calvinist Puritan view was God has a plan for your life, your marriage, your family, your church, and your government. You find out what that plan is, put it into place. The pietist view was Martin Luther, remember him? He had this personal experience, personal revelation, the just shall live by faith, very personal to him. But some princes wanted to break away from Rome, and these princes says, okay, guess what? Kingdom, you're Lutheran. If you don't like it, leave. And so the people in the kingdom, some of them left, but most of them said, okay, we're Lutheran. What do we believe again? So for those people, it was not a personal experience. It was the state dictating it. And so a revival movement spread through these Lutheran countries. And the revival movement is called Pietism. And it said, look, it's more than just believing doctrine. It's having a personal experience with Jesus. And when you have this personal experience with Jesus, your life should change. And you should no longer get involved in worldly things, like worldly bars and worldly theaters and worldly brothels and worldly government. What? Oh, yeah, well, all the worldly people go to those places. There's worldly people in government, and if you're really a Christian, you should not get involved in government. So you had these two views that these pastors had in early America. One said, hey, God's got a plan, put it in place. The other says, oh, no, it's worldly, don't get involved. This is best illustrated by two pastors. They were the Muhlenbergs. Their father was Henry Muhlenberg, who was a Lutheran pietist pastor, the founder of the Lutheran Church in America. John Peter and his brother went to Germany, went to seminary, came back, and John Peter was a pastor of a Lutheran church, Emmanuel Church in Woodstock, Virginia. Get this, he had to get licensed as an Anglican minister in order to pastor a Lutheran congregation, because Virginia was an Anglican colony, right? And then his brother pastored a Lutheran church in New York. Now, John Peter goes to hear Patrick Henry give his Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death speech. John Peter Muhlenberg goes to George Washington and says, I want to help. Washington said, fine, you're a colonel, go get your men. John Peter goes to his church, has a sermon out of Ecclesiastes, there's a time for all things. He finally ends, there's a time to preach and a time to fight, takes off his clerical robe. Underneath, he has the uniform of a Continental Army officer, has an altar call, 300 men of his church come forward, kiss their wives goodbye, and they ride off and become the 8th Virginia Regiment. And they fight in all these different battles. He gets promoted to Major General. He's elected as a congressman to the first session of the U.S. Congress, which passed the First Amendment. Now, his brother, Frederick Muhlenberg, during this time he was writing letters to John Peter saying, you have become too involved in matters which, as a preacher, you have nothing whatsoever to do. John Peter writes back, accuses Frederick of being a Tory British sympathizer. Frederick writes back and says he cannot serve two masters. And then the British invade New York, and they burn Frederick Muhlenberg's church. His wife and children are forced to leave the city. He decides, well, maybe we should get involved. He ends up becoming elected a U.S. congressman, and he's elected the first Speaker of the House. He's the first Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. And what is passed in this very first session of Congress, with these two Lutheran pastors there, one of them being the Speaker? The Bill of Rights, the First Amendment. Does anybody honestly think that these two pastors would vote to outlaw themselves? That they would vote to pass an amendment that says pastors should not get involved in government, religious people shouldn't get involved in government? No, because they were religious people, they were pastors, and they did get involved. The First Amendment was to keep the federal government out of the state and church business. That's why it says Congress shall make no law. Who's limited by it? It limits the federal Congress. Doesn't limit the states, doesn't limit the people, doesn't limit the pastors, doesn't limit the kids at their graduation, doesn't limit coaches, doesn't limit anybody but the federal government. So in other words, when the subject of religion, when the subject of what religion believes about marriage, when that subject comes before the federal courts, they should throw their hands up and say, we have no jurisdiction over this. Congress shall make no law. Not through the legislature and not through legislating through the courts. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, establishing their views, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Anyway, so in New England, there was this experiment. The pastors realized that the kingdom of God could never be forced from the top down. Jesus never forced anybody to believe in him. It's not like Islam, where Muhammad said, whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him. Jesus said something difficult. Many disciples walked with him no more. Jesus turns to Peter, says, you going to go too? Peter said, where else can we go? You're the only one with the words of eternal life. But he was willing to let him go. He did not force anybody. And so many of these pastors came from Europe where the kings were forcing people. And so they said, wait a second, if the kingdom of God can never be forced from the top down, how's it going to happen? Well, they thought if the majority of the people held godly values and they elected representatives who held those values, then laws would be passed reflecting those values, and it could come from the bottom up, not forced from the top down. And so this is the New England experiment. Does power flow from the Creator to the king and he dispenses it to the people? Or does it flow from the Creator directly to the people and they choose from amongst themselves their political leaders? Now, where did the pastors get these ideas? Remember, Calvin Coolidge says that the ideas that went into the Declaration came from the sermons of the early colonial clergy. Where did these early colonial clergy get these ideas? They were very well-read men. They were the most brilliant men of the day. Well, they got some from Rome, England, right? The different Magna Carta and Alfred the Great, the Code of Patrick. But prior to that, they got ideas from the Roman Republic. And prior to that, they got ideas from democracy. I'm going to be talking about these tomorrow. But ultimately, they got it from Israel. Lo and behold, here's Harvard president Samuel Langdon, 1788, gave an address titled "The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States." And so the most common form of government in world history is a king, but Israel is the first instance in history of an entire nation being ruled without a king. Remember those first 400 years when they came out of Egypt and they came into the promised land? Right? The first 400 years, no king. Everyone was equal before the law. And the law said there's no respect of persons in judgment, rich or poor, everyone's the same. Male, female, made in the image of the Creator. Lo and behold, this is the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth. Because everywhere else there's a king, and if you're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. In Israel, for the first 400 years, there was no king. Everyone was equal in the image of the Creator. Just an amazing, there's no royal family to butter up next to. Israel was the first nation with private land ownership. All those boring chapters where they did surveys and lots and divided up the land. This tribe gets from the river to the tree. See, this tribe gets from the creek over to the hill. You know, and Caleb's daughter gets off the donkey and goes to her dad saying, hey, it's my wedding. Can I get the spring on the other side of the field? He says, okay. My mom's name was Tirzah. And the first mention of Tirzah in the Bible is she was the daughter of Zelophehad, this old guy who had no sons. The girls go to Moses, says, hey, you're dividing up the land, but don't we get any too? Is our dad's name going to be forgotten just because he doesn't have any sons? And Moses says, okay, you get land too. Just marry someone within your tribe. This was unheard of. Individual women getting land, individual families getting land, where in Egypt the Pharaoh controlled it all. And wherever there's a king, the king controls it. Matter of fact, if you live in a place where there's a king, you never really own the land. It's always conditional of you staying on the nice side of the king. You cross him, he'll take your land and take your life, right? You know, in England, the king would give somebody an estate, but if you cross the king, he'll take away the estate and hang you. So Israel, first nation with private land ownership. Now, if you can own land, the land was permanently titled to the families, by the way. So if you got in a pinch and sold it every 50 years, it reverted back. This prevented a dictator from accumulating the land and putting the people back into servitude. Now, if you can own land, you can accumulate stuff, and the Bible called it being blessed. Karl Marx called it being a capitalist. You got stuff, you worked hard, you saved it. Israel's the first nation with no police because everyone was taught the law, everyone enforced the law. Israel was the first nation with no standing army because every man was in the militia. Israel had no prison system because the law said swift justice at the gate and a city of refuge you could run away to. Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system where when you harvested your field, you left the gleanings for the poor people to pick through. So the poor were taken care of without some big government collecting the money and doling it back. And the problem is when the government doles it back, you have politicians doing the doling. And they want to get reelected, and they're tempted to give out money and entitlements and contracts and cylinder and everything else to those they think they can funnel it back into their campaign. But if the people themselves leave the gleanings, then the poor people are taken care of without that concentrating of power. Israel had a system of honesty that provided a basis for commerce because God hated unjust weights and measures, and you're told to tell the truth, and God hates lying, and don't bear false witness. And so when you're doing a deal with somebody, you know they're going to be honest. This builds a basis for commerce, and Israel got to choose its own leaders. Here's Moses, Deuteronomy 1. It says, Moses spake unto the children of Israel, how can I myself alone bear your cumbrance? Take you wise men and understanding, known among your tribes, and I'll make them rulers over you. In other words, Moses didn't go out among 3 million people and say, you're the leaders. No, he said, you pick the ones known amongst your tribe. You bring them to me, and I'll make them your leaders. And so we see that Israel got to elect their own leaders, and they men that fear God, love truth, and hate covetousness. And it was a decentralized system. So from the outside, it looked confusing. On the inside, it was maximum individual liberty and freedom. Anybody could be raised up in leadership in a time of need. I mean, look at Deborah. Here's a woman that becomes a judge, a leader in Israel, simply because she knew the law and she was honest, and people would travel all across the country. She sat under a tree and she'd decide their cases for 40 years. Where else in the world could a woman, just by virtue of her knowing the law and being honest, rise to leadership? In Egypt, you'd have to be related to the Pharaoh's family. In China, you'd have to be related to the emperor's family. Here in Israel, anybody could be raised up. And so it's this comparison of kings where political leaders rule and the people are the servants, or do the people rule through their representatives, and the representatives are actually their servants. You hire them and fire them. And so this I found the most fascinating. Israel was the first nation with a literate populace. So Sumeria, did you know they had 1,500 cuneiform characters? Imagine memorizing 1,500 anythings. That's pretty complicated. But only the kings and the scribes could read. It started as an accounting method because the king had lots of grain and wanted his accountants to keep track of it all. And in Egypt, they had 3,000 hieroglyphic characters. And only the pharaohs and the scribes could read them. Matter of fact, the scribes kept it complicated on purpose as job security. What does that hieroglyph say? I don't know. Let's go get the scribe, right? China had 10,000 pictogram characters. And only the upper class could read. The slaves and the peasants obviously could not. Matter of fact, sort of like in Virginia and Maryland, prior to the Civil War, they had laws making it a crime to teach slaves to read. Read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. He says he was a young little slave boy, and he was in the house, and the slave master's sister-in-law was teaching him the alphabet. The slave master walks in, yells at her, says, "Don't you dare teach slaves to read. They'll grow discontent and want to run away." He's a little older. He's in the house. He's looking at a newspaper, trying to sound out the words. They snatch the newspaper away, chase him out of the house. In other words, if you are a dictator, you want the people to be ignorant. You want to get them going through the motions of learning, but you want to make sure they don't learn anything, sort of like a Common Core. You want them to stay real ignorant because it's easier to control and manipulate ignorant people. So when Moses came down the mountain, he didn't just have the law that gave them equality, law that said they were all equal, and law that gave them rights from a creator. He had the law in a 22-character alphabet that was so easy to learn, the entire nation learned how to read. And so this is the first instance in history of an entirely literate populace. And not only could they read, they were required to read. Now, we remember the Gospels, and Jesus is speaking. He says, "You have read, and you have seen it written." It's assumed that everyone he's talking to could read, and they read the law. They grew up reading the law. And it was the priest's job to not only teach the law, it was the priest's job to teach the people to read the law. And so, as long as the priest did it, the system worked. Harry S. Truman said, "The fundamental basis of this nation's laws was given to Moses on the Mount. If we don't have a proper fundamental moral background, we will finally end up with a totalitarian government which does not believe in rights for anybody except the state." So it's this situation where one side is a king, the other side is no king. So everybody hold up a fist in one hand, like the screen there. Hold up a fist and say concentrated power. And then your fingers apart with the other hand, say separated power. Then go back to the fist and say concentrated power. That is world history. For most of world history, power is in the hands of the kings, pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, sultans, and czars. Every now and then, a group of people, starting with Israel, get this rare opportunity to stretch the rubber band and put power in the hands of the people. But in times of crises, the rubber band snaps back. And so we see it's power in the hands of the people. Now, if the people rule, they're all selfish because they're all got this selfish DNA inside of them, and they're going to be chaos and anarchy unless they're taught these morals. But you still have that selfish nature. You're going to want to try to get around the morals. What's the key ingredient? A God who's watching everybody, wants you to be fair, and is going to hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal something. You know you can get away with it. And then you think, wait a second, God's watching. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate with this stealing thing. And it creates this thing in your head called a conscience. So if the entire nation believes God is watching, he wants you to be fair, he's going to hold you accountable, everybody modifies their behavior to fit in with what pleases this God, and you have complete order in society with no police following everybody around. It's maximum individual freedom and liberty with no government, with no big centralized force. And so it worked as long as the priest taught the law. Here's William Jennings Bryan, 1913, said, personal responsibility to God gives strength and morality. There is a powerful restraining influence in the belief of an all-seeing eye scrutinizes every thought and word and act of the individual. Margaret Thatcher said, the Decalogue, 10 Commandments, are the origin of the sanctity of the individual. You don't get that in any other political creed. It is personal liberty with personal responsibility. Your founding fathers came over with that. Montesquieu, a French political philosopher, said, kings rule by fear. You do what they say because you're afraid of them. He says, for a republic to work where the people rule themselves, you need virtue. You need the people to have virtue, and that virtue is empowered by the thought of this God watching. Now, it only works with a Judeo-Christian God. An Islamic God says, hey, there's an infidel woman around, you can rape her, it's okay. Right? So it's the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible. When the priest stopped teaching the law, the whole thing fell apart. So the high priest Eli had his own son sleeping with women in the tabernacle of meeting. There's a story of a Levite with a concubine. The law said the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. The fact that he has a concubine means that he's not keeping the law, much less teaching it. And so they're traveling, and the house is surrounded by sodomites who are banging on the doors. There's something about that behavior that's not content with doing it. They want to force it on others. Lust is never appeased by yielding to it. And the more you yield to it, the more it wants to just grow. And so the poor girl is raped and dies, and his body chopped up, and every tribe gets together, and they kill the sodomites. And it ends with this last line that says, every man did what was right in his own eyes. Why did everyone do what was right in their own eyes? Because the priest stopped teaching them what was right in the Lord's eyes. And so this whole system revolved around the priest teaching the law. When they stopped, the people had chaos. They went to Samuel the prophet. They said, you know what, this isn't working. We want to be like all the other countries. We want a king. Samuel cries, and the Lord said, they did not reject thee. They rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So they get King Saul. He turns around, and he kills most of the priests. Only one of them escaped to David, Abiathar. And so Yale President Ezra Stiles said the secular welfare of God's ancient people depended upon their virtue, their religion, their observance of that holy covenant which Israel entered into with God. And Harvard President Samuel Langdon wrote, the only government which had a proper claim to a divine establishment was so far from including the idea of a king that it was a high crime for Israel to ask to be like the other nations. And when they were thus gratified, it was rather as a punishment. And so how is power taken out of the hands of the people and brought back into the hands of a king, a tyrant? So we talked about this stretching of the rubber band, taking the power of the king and separating it. But how does it snap back? If you get rid of the idea of a God, then all you got is raw, human, lustful nature that's going to want to get around these rules, these morals. Some will keep the morals out of habit, but other ones, water seeks its own level. They're going to find a way to steal, kill, destroy, and it's going to be crime in the streets and robbing stores and windows being smashed and buildings being set on fire. And everybody's going to say, government, please step in with your militarized police force and your armored personnel carriers and come down the street. And they'll come down, they'll collect guns from everybody's houses, and yeah, they'll restore order, but when the dust settles, you'll have just given up ruling yourself and you'll be back to being ruled by a king. And so there are philosophers through history that said, hey, because in times of crises, people want a strong leader, let's create crises, and then we can be the leader, right? And so one was Machiavelli. He lived 500 years ago in Italy. Are you still with me? Yeah. Italy was a bunch of city-states, Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena, and they all had armies and navies and fought. And Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop this infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is so good that any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal, whatever. And so if a prince conquers a city, they would hate him. But if the prince pays criminals to kill cows, burn barns, create crisis and terror, the people would cry out for help. The prince would come in and kill the very criminals he bribed. Nobody would know the better for it, and they'd praise the prince as a hero. And so it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. You know, never let a good crisis go to waste. You heard that? So again, it's good marketing. You go around the back of the house, set it on fire. You go around the front of the house, sell them a fire extinguisher, and they'll pay anything for it and thank you for being there. And that inspired someone named Hegel. Isn't he handsome? He lived in Germany in the early 1800s. Napoleon conquered Prussia, the German kingdom, so easily that the German king said, we're not going to let that happen again. We need to strengthen the state. So Hegel's the philosopher. He says the state is God walking on earth. And Hegel comes up with what he called Hegelian dialectics. Sounds complicated, but it's not. It's a triangle. One corner is a thesis, the opposite corner is an antithesis or antithesis, and the top corner is a synthesis. So you start off with the thesis, you create the antithesis. In other words, you create a problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. Then that becomes the new thesis, and you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. And you do this over and over again until you move from the people ruling themselves back to a dictator, back to a king ruling it. And so this inspired Karl Marx. And Karl Marx says, well, how do you create the antithesis? How do you create the crisis? He says you send in agitators, organizers, labor organizers, community organizers, agent provocateurs. You send them into communities to find the fault line, the tension lines, and you stir up crises and hatred and violence until there's blood in the streets, and then everybody is willing to let a strong leader come in just to restore order. And so this, and he'd organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, which is the working class against the business owners, organize the poor against the rich, the blacks against the whites, the Catholics against the Protestants, the Muslims against the Christians, the Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo and Rwanda. They really don't care who the two sides are or what the issues are. Their goal is the crisis that destabilizes the social order. And so this inspired someone named Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky rode around with Al Capone's hitmen in Chicago, Frank Nitti, and saw how all you had to do was kill a few people, smash a few windows, and the whole neighborhood would submit to the mob and pay extortion protection money. So Saul Alinsky applied this to politics and said, all you got to do is create a really bad crisis and everybody will give in to you and you can push your agenda because they're in such a hurry to get past the crises. And so Saul Alinsky says the organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. The organizer polarizes the issue and helps lead his forces into conflict. The organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent. Fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. In other words, you want to stir up racism. You want to stir up class warfare. You want to have all kinds of terrible crises. Why? He says the organizer knows that the real action is in reaction to the opposition. He must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not motivated enough to act. This is the politics that's being portrayed or done upon America right now. Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis at Wellesley College on Saul Alinsky. And our president was a community organizer with the Saul Alinsky method there in Chicago. And so whenever we see the news, there are forces that want there to be the crisis, and they brilliantly want to try to stir up. It's basically Proverbs 6, where it says 6 things the Lord hates. The last one is he that soweth discord amongst the brethren. And it's only the gospel that can bring healing. They want the opposite. Now, in my closing ideas here, I want to point out that the most common form of government in history is a king, right? And then I ask the question, who is the king in America? You got to think. Who's the king in America? Well, the signer of the Constitution, Gouverneur Morris, said, the magistrate is not the king, the people are the king. Chief Justice John Jay said, the people are the sovereign of this country. Andrew Jackson said, the people are the government, the sovereign power. President Polk said, the people are the only sovereigns recognized by our Constitution. Gerald Ford, never forget that in America, our sovereign is the citizen. The state is a servant of the individual. It must never become an anonymous monstrosity that masters everyone. General Omar Bradley, in the United States, it is the people who are sovereign. The government is theirs to speak their voice and to voice their will. Reagan, only by positing or placing sovereignty in the people and not the state can we hope to protect freedom. Do you see where America's founders tried to copy the example of Israel? Where Israel did not have a king, but the people got to rule, and every individual person had an individual accountability and relationship with God, and they would choose those known amongst their tribes that they would raise up to be their different tribal leaders. They'd all get together at a sort of a national congress called the Sanhedrin, right? And so it was this representative form of government. Ezra Stiles said, all the forms of civil polity or politics have been tried by mankind except one, and that seems to have been reserved in providence to be realized in America. And what he's saying is that this was on a large scale where Israel was on a smaller scale. So here's Theodore Roosevelt. In no other place and at no other time has the experiment of government of the people, by the people, for the people, been tried on so vast a scale as here in our own country. Literally, we took the Israel model and we made it this huge thing that encompassed this entire land. And it worked. Here is Calvin Coolidge. The history of government on this earth has been almost entirely rule of force held in the hands of a few. Under our Constitution, America committed itself to power in the hands of the people. So who's the king in America? The people are. Now, I speak at a lot of pastors' conferences, and I point out, I said, Pastor, you know, imagine if the emperor were sitting in your pew. I talked about Constantine became a Christian, so there you had Christian Roman emperors. By 379 AD, there was a Christian Roman emperor named Theodosius. And he went to church in Milan, Italy. And the pastor was Bishop Ambrose, St. Ambrose. And I said, pastors, could you imagine having the emperor in your church? And then I say, you do. Because in America, the people are the kings. 70% of Americans identify themselves as Christian. They're going to somebody's churches and they're sitting in your pews. And so that makes you, the pastor, a counselor to the king, right? And so have you seen the movie The Lord of the Rings? There's this one scene in there where there's this King Theoden, and he's got this spell cast on him, and he's like gray hair and gray eyes, and he's just like out of it, you know. And he has this counselor who's named Wormtongue, and he's like saying, stay asleep, don't get involved. Pretty soon it'll all be over. Just stay asleep. And then in comes Gandalf, and he sort of casts the devil out of the guy and says, wake up, your kingdom is being overrun. And so he, before the camera begins to wake up and says, whoa, what has been going on? He says, dark have been my dreams of late. And Gandalf says, well, maybe you'll remember your strength if you hold your sword. And so I tell people, imagine if you're visiting an Old Testament king and you're going through the streets of Jerusalem and you see crimes and murders and rapes, and you go into the king's chamber and he has his head in his hand and he complains to you. And he says, did you see all this crime coming in here? I wish somebody would fix it. And you like tap him on the shoulder and say, excuse me, you're the king. This is your kingdom. They're your servants that are messing up. You are the one accountable to God to fix this mess. That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the terrible things going on, saying, man, I wish somebody would come along and fix this mess. Hello, reach through the TV tube and tap you on the shoulder. You are the king. The politicians are your servants. You don't just have the freedom to vote in America, you will be held accountable to God for what your servants do in America. So it's time we wake up the king. You say, well, I need somebody to tell me what to do. Imagine the king saying, I need somebody to tell me what to do. Maybe one of my servants can tell me what to do. And then you think of the judges. Who appoints the Supreme Court justices, right? The president puts their name up and the Senate approves them. Well, how did the president get in? Oh, we elected him. How did the Senate get in? We elected him. So imagine with the scenario of a king, okay? Here's your king. He's sitting on a throne and he has a butler and a maid. And he hired these butlers and a maid. He has them. And the butler and the maid decide to go out and appoint somebody as a janitor. And the king's walking around the castle and the janitor says, oh, you can't go on that side of the castle anymore. It's like, who are you to tell me? Oh, I'm appointed. I'm the janitor. You can't go in there. Well, how did you get here? Well, the butler and the maid put me in there. That's like the Supreme Court justice saying, you can't do this anymore. Well, who are you, Supreme Court justice? Well, I've been appointed by the president and the Senate approved me. And well, who put them in? The people. They're your servants. And again, we don't just have the privilege of voting. We're going to be held accountable to God for what our servants do. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, the church is the conscience of the state. And then I want to remind pastors and all Christians, I said the most important thing is to bring people to Christ. Everybody says, yes, yes. Then I said the second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. If Sharia law, Islam takes over, it's the death penalty for you to share the gospel with somebody, right? If you go to Saudi Arabia and say, oh, you know, Jesus is the way to heaven, they'll kill you. If you say Jerusalem's the capital of Israel, they want to kill you, right? If you go to North Korea, the communist government will throw you in a labor camp the rest of your life if you try to tell somebody the gospel. And if the homosexual gay agenda goes on unopposed with us being silent, they're going to limit what you can say about the gospel. If you're really convinced that the gospel is the answer, you are going to be involved doing something to preserve the freedom to spread the gospel. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge said, the United States is the world's best hope
Beware how you trifle with your marvelous inheritance. For if we stumble and fall, freedom and civilization everywhere will go down in ruin. Franklin Roosevelt said, rulers in Europe increased their power over the common men. The seamen they sent to find gold instead found the way of escape for the common man from those rulers. What they found over the western horizon was not the silken jewels of Cathay, China, but mankind's second chance, a chance to create a new world after he had almost spoiled an old one. Ronald Reagan, here for the first time in all the thousands of years of man's relation to man, the founding fathers established the idea that you and I had within ourselves, the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. Let's do it. Let's go back to the model of Israel. Let's preserve this great country for our kids. Can you say amen? Thank you so much.